So now that we've kind of established kind of the big picture Cold War context, let's kind of drill down into the way things were here in America. So in the United States, you really have after World War II, women had been so engaged in the military, in fighting World War II and standing up, for kind of the total war concept. And so they're engaged in that process. But then the war's over in 1945, and the soldiers are coming home. And so the idea is that the women willingly step away from the jobs, they step away from those things. They want to get married, they want to celebrate life. And so women do what women do, which is, they have families. And so a big part of this post-war economy is the baby boom, is this idea that women wanted to create families. And remember, these are people that are coming out of the Great Depression, and all that entailed, the frustration, hand to mouth living, the trying to hold things together. Then you had the war and kind of that sacrifice and volunteerism, and everyone's all in. And now you have this kind of moment where, okay, things are finally back to normal. And so people want to have families, they want to have recreation, they want to kind of really live the ideal, right? Because it's been a rough couple decades. And so they want to enjoy themselves. And so that's kind of a lot of what the 1950s is about. And a lot of the idealism and a lot of this sense of, that everything has to be kind of look perfect on the outside is very much about kind of this not wanting to move past kind of the troubles of the 30s and the early 40s. And so, you have this major change, right? And so you have lots of people having babies. And of course, now in 2019, we're dealing with an aging population because of that. And so it's a major demographic challenge. But in the 1950s, it was just really the product of people ready to celebrate life, And so you have, the post-war economy was not perfect, right? Anytime you end a war, trying to get back to a peacetime footing is challenging. So there's a housing crisis, right? So we have to deal with some wage and price kind of issues. And they start removing rationing. And what will happen is, and of course, we were labor history, we would talk about the strikes that happened after World War II. Truman basically busts those up. What really happens a lot is going to be that that you have automobiles kind of becoming a big thing. So lots of automobiles taking place. We're going to have, you're going to have the suburbs being created. We'll see that they'll create the GI Bill, or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. This will provide a lot of money for higher education, money for home loans, money for business loans. And this will create a really active middle class. And here's the thing about the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. It will help African Americans as well as white Americans. Now, we can critique it that it helps white Americans more. We can critique the housing because they come up with the process of redlining, where they limit where African Americans can buy homes. So it's not perfect, right? It's got gaps in it. But there are African Americans that benefit from the GI Bill, that benefit from the low interest home loans, and as well as white society. And you really just have this growing middle class. Now, the problem is this growing middle class is going to it is going to be segregated. It's going to be predominantly white and less so African American. And even your middle class African Americans will struggle with the housing situation. So you'll begin to have this existence of two Americas, an America that's very affluent and middle class and white, and an America that is not white and or not affluent. Right. And so this division is going to be kind of a big problem as we move into the 1960s. In fact, poverty is going to be a major concern at the end of the 50s and into the early 60s. So when Kennedy's president, he's really dealing with this a lot. But under Truman, Truman talked about trying to get a national health insurance plan. So this is how long we've been talking about health insurance. Kind of crazy to think about. But so Truman's president, he's gonna really fall out of favor, largely because he's going to be seen as failing with China, failing in the Cold War. So when Eisenhower comes in, everyone's, I like Ike, and Ike is wonderful. And so you really kind of have Eisenhower being the face of the 1950s, really, even though he doesn't become president until 1953. So the results of this post-war economy, again, suburbs, the mass production of houses like Levittown, and, kind of some interesting impacts of that. Of course, this creates the suburban sprawl. This creates white flight, and the problems that will come out of that. Automobiles employ a lot of people during this period. The cars are huge. Everyone has one. Televisions, people start buying up televisions, and that becomes the next big thing. And this is going to create advertising. This is going to create entertainment. Of course, Elvis on television, and then later the Beatles. So again, this cultural impact of television that really kind of dominates how people see things. And there's a really good section in the readings that talk about that women in television. And so I'll record a video kind of taking you through some of those documents. So that's a really interesting one. And then you've got other things. You've got the early computers coming into this, early copy machines, vaccines. The polio vaccine becomes a big thing. The Interstate Highway Act, major infrastructure spending in the 1950s that Eisenhower pushes through Congress as both a defense bill because, this way we can move troops faster, but also as a response to the suburbs and people moving out and the increased car traffic and stuff. And you really just have this period of consumption and consumerism and materialism because people have babies and they want to buy baby products, and you've got television ads and all this kind of stuff, right? And people are buying homes. And as we move through the 50s, that group of babies that were born in, 46, 47, 48, as they start to become teenagers, what you're going to see is it kind of creates this generation gap, right? You have this group of young people that are listening to rock music, that are doing these things, that are rejecting this kind of conformity that their parents have celebrated, right? That their parents are like, yes, I want to live this Leave It to Beaver life, right? The mom's at home making cookies, waiting on the husband. She's all concerned about keeping her husband happy, and all she wants is to have babies and volunteer at the school, and the husband's out going to work, and, the kids are watching Lone Ranger and Howdy Doody, and, they're following these typical, kind of gender roles. So this is the ideal, right? We all know that's not exactly true, right? That's the ideal everybody tries to emulate, but the reality is people are people, and they do people-y things. And when people behave like people, they're going to do all kinds of different things. And so, we have to understand that even though this has this picture perfect world in which women were largely consigned to very specific roles, we really have a return of this sphere of influence, if you will, for women. So it becomes actually very, very restrictive in the 1950s. But you'll see a rejection of that as you have a generation gap, as you have young women looking at their moms going, I don't want that life. And then you start to have, people really questioning that conformity in a lot of different ways. And so it really becomes a whole new thing. I love this particular picture of the mainframe computers and how big they were. So really kind of just images to kind of talk about that. So again, two Americas, you have a white society that's focused on conformity and consumption. That is lots of education, lots of economic opportunity, lots of, consumerism. And I mentioned here that rural whites were less likely to benefit. So rural white society might not be exactly that way. There would be a class distinction. Now, unfortunately, I think most rural whites would have identified with the middle class or affluent white society, even if they weren't affluent. But they certainly, you definitely have kind of this perception of what white society is. And again, lots of focus on rigid gender roles and lots of anxiety about child rearing. This is when Dr. Spock becomes a big thing. And you do absolutely have kind of this rise of conservatism, of women volunteering in conservative organizations and that sort of thing during this period. Then the other side of America is going to be people that, and I put on here, on the margins of prosperity, people who were limited by discrimination. where you have redlining, where you have lack of educational opportunity, in unequal educational opportunity, and it really kind of creates some frustration. And Jim Crow laws that kind of restrict African Americans from where they live, where they can work, where they can shop, where they can go to school. And the North is dealing with the redlining, with the housing discrimination, and the subsequent educational segregation that comes simply from controlling where people live. So one of the interesting stories about about this period is how the North, once Brown v. Board knocks down segregation, the North kind of points at the South and is like, "Ha ha, you have to clean up your act." And then all of a sudden they realize, oh, wait a minute, we have segregated schools, but their segregated schools were due to where people lived. And so when that starts to become an issue and they start facing busing, it becomes really controversial. And so, so you have for Black and Latino communities, they're going to be less shaped by kind of the idealistic Leave It to Beaver household, because for those women, that was not their experience. I mean, they had worked in World War II, they had participated in World War II. But when the war was over, they still typically had to work some. So you had African American women still working as domestic servants. You had Latino women still taking jobs, a variety of jobs. So that because of their poverty, not necessarily poverty, not everybody was poor, but because of the lack of economic opportunity, because of discrimination and racism, women in those groups, in those ethnic groups, typically had to have work. So they didn't get to enjoy that whole kind of perception of this rigid gender role. Now, they have their own kind of restrictions, in the sense that, Latino communities tend to have their own kind of that own kind of unique culture, gender roles, and that sort of thing. So that still applies, but you definitely have kind of a different circumstance taking place there for women. So the women of color are going to experience the 50s a little bit differently, and I think that's why you see a lot of activism coming from women in the 1950s, right? And of course, the Supreme Court is going to really kind of shape a lot of this, primarily with Brown v. Board, right? I love this particular ad. You can Google them, 1950s sexist ads. There's all kinds of interesting little ads that depict women as subservient and only caring about their house and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, just a whole series of pictures there that kind of show you what I mean by two different Americas. And again, you've got this idea of restricting housing, of white versus Black classrooms, and really kind of the impact of segregation in this period. For Latinos, they still face a lot of discrimination. They are actually going to be a part of this 1950s civil rights movement, in part because in the South and in the West, they had moved up with the Bracero program to take jobs because we needed people to work, and the South was being industrialized, and there's agriculture, and so you had these communities that were heavily Latino, and there was Spanish was the primary language, and there's lots of education discrimination. So in white societies that dealt with Latino populations, they would often resort to the same types of discrimination that they used against African Americans. But a lot of times they would do this with language, right? So language is going to be the big issue. So you have a couple of court cases, Mendez v. Westminster in California, that says that you can't segregate based on race as far as Latino kids. So the first kind of racial desegregation case has to do with Latinos in California. Now, the reason why it's not as significant as Brown v. Board is because it involves, it's a state case, state of California, and so it only applies to the state of California, but it's a foundational case going into Brown v. Board. And Delgado v. Bastrop ISD here in Texas is going to have to do with Bastrop ISD having a class for students that needed language skills, except they typically didn't care what their language skills were. They looked at their last name and said, oh, your name's Mendez, so you must have to go here. Oh, your name's Delgado, you must have to go here. And they basically create two different classrooms, one for white students, one for Latino students. And you see the same thing happening in Texas as regarding jury trials, that if you have a community that's predominantly Latino, you should have Latino representation on the juries. So you start to have these kind of challenges to places, and the discrimination against Latinos was primarily in places like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So those cases start to be tackled. And so I've mentioned before the GI Forum creates and LULAC come into being. And you're also going to see that because of kind of this, what had happened with the Bracero program, this is going to ultimately lead to the creation of the United Farm Workers Union. Of course, and Dolores Huerta is a founding member and really kind of a driving force behind this. So you're going to see Latino women in a lot of ways kind of taking ownership of Latino movement. Even the American GI Forum is formed in part because you had a Latino veteran who was killed in World War II, and his wife, they wanted to have a big, the community wanted to have a big funeral, and it was the white funeral home was big enough, and his wife wanted to have it there, and they said no. And so she ends up going to Dr. His name escapes me. Anyways, goes to he's a doctor, but I can't think of his name. Anyways, goes to him, and he creates the American GI Forum, right? So you have lots of women in the Latino community that are really kind of pushing back against this stuff. The case of Mendez v. Westminster has to do with a little girl going to school. So you have kind of some interesting nuances there. So civil rights is going to be born out of that, right? Like I said, the United Farm Workers Union. For African Americans, you're going to see, again, the role of women is going to be really huge, right? So you'd had, African Americans had served in World War II, fought to fight with the Tuskegee Airmen, Dory Miller at Pearl Harbor. And Truman forces the integration of the armed forces in 1948, right? And so the NAACP starts to really kind of work cases through. They really kind of start to become a force to be reckoned with things like the Sweat v. Painter case, which ends discrimination in public universities. And then Norris v. Alabama, which is kind of a jury trial case, ultimately resulting in the Brown v. Board decision of 1954, which has national implications for ending segregation. And so this is being, Linda Brown is is kind of the lead case on that. And so you have those events taking place, and again, you'd had African Americans, veterans that had been protesting. So you had a whole series of things that are taking place. But what's interesting is that really the 50s civil rights movement starts with the murder of Emmett Till. Starts with his mother, Mamie Till, insisting that her son's corpse be viewed. That I want the world to see what they did to my boy. And so her courage in doing that. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And of course, it's interesting. Rosa Parks was not the first person to refuse to give up her seat in Montgomery. And so really there's a lot of interesting nuances about her story that it was kind of prearranged. It wasn't necessarily, it was somewhat spontaneous, but they had been looking for some time for the correct person to not give up their seat. And so she knew that they were doing that. And so it's kind of interesting. It's a more nuanced situation than just she randomly was tired one day. But nevertheless, she refuses to give up her seat. Martin Luther King leads this boycott, and it kind of forces the integration of the Montgomery bus system, elevates Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You have the confrontation at Little Rock, and I cannot think of her name, the woman that was behind the students that led the NAACP in Little Rock, Arkansas. She helped kind of organize things. You had several female students in that group who integrated Little Rock High School, and you have this challenge by the states of kind of this federal law. You have Eisenhower sending troops in to force the desegregation. So lots of kind of interesting nuances there. And you have the beginning of the sit-in movement, which again starts with women's leadership on how to resist nonviolently, how to take action. So women are a big part of the civil rights movement. And for African American women, for Latino women, and of course, ironically, you have white women that are kind of being pushed to the side. So it's interesting that having looked at suffrage and how white women dominated the suffrage movement, that now when we get to the civil rights movement, it's going to be women of color that really kind of are at the vanguard of pushing more civil rights. We need more. We need more. We need more. And so it's kind of interesting that takes place, right? And so the other part of this is going to be that you have a gap in the prosperity, and that we have kind of this difference in opportunity between men and women. That women were supposed to conform a certain way, and that you have lots of kind of backlash against the Brown v. Board, and you've got kind of the rise of civil rights movement. Women as a special kind of consumer group in this period. And of course, then you have, the changes that begin to take place towards the end of the 50s, whether it's because of integration, whether it's because of television and rock and roll, whether it's because you have a generation of young people that are starting to come into their own as we move into the 1960s. And of course, John F. Kennedy is going to win the 1960 election, really kind of usher in this period of youth and optimism, and really kind of usher in kind of this period where we try to, where we feel like we can fix these problems, right? And it's out of this that you're going to have really kind of the meat of the civil rights movement and the beginning of women's rights kind of becoming a major issue. And this will take us into the 1970s. And of course, remember, simmering behind all of this is going to be the issues of the 1950s with the Cold War, Korea, the space race, the fear of nuclear weapons, ultimately kind of the Berlin Wall going up, that kind of thing. So you've got things that are happening globally. And then here at home, we're trying to wrestle with kind of this gap in the ideal and what's really happening. And of course, women, like I said, they're at ground zero of this, either as people of color that are pushing back, or either as white women who are really kind of being pushed off into the corner and told to sit down and look pretty, right? So anyway, so that kind of takes you through the two Americas, and then we'll be talking about the civil rights movement.